"There's no room for you here." Those were my son's exact words. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door he just slammed in my face. The son I raised alone. The son I sacrificed everything for. I turned around and left that day. But what happened the next morning? I never saw it coming. Let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Julia, and I'm 58 years old. For the past 23 years, I've been both mother and father to my son Daniel. His father left us when Daniel was only 6 months old. Just packed his bags one Tuesday morning and never looked back. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. I remember standing in our tiny apartment, holding Daniel in my arms, watching through the window as his father's car disappeared down the street. That was the moment I made myself a promise. Daniel would never feel the absence of a father. I would be enough for both of us. And I tried. God knows I tried. I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. During the day, I was a receptionist at a dental clinic. The pay wasn't great, but it was stable, and they let me bring Daniel with me sometimes when he was sick and couldn't go to daycare. At night, I cleaned offices in the downtown business district. I'd put Daniel to bed at 7, wait until my neighbor Mrs. Patterson came over to watch him, then head out into the cold night. I'd scrub floors, empty trash bins, wipe down desks until 2 in the morning. Then I'd come home, sleep for 4 hours, and do it all over again. Money was always tight. There were months when I had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying Daniel new shoes. I chose the shoes. We'd light candles and pretend we were camping when the lights got shut off. Daniel thought it was an adventure. I thought it was survival. But I never let him see me cry. Never let him see me break down when I opened the fridge and found it nearly empty. I'd smile and tell him we were having a special breakfast. Just cereal today. Aren't we lucky? His childhood wasn't filled with expensive toys or family vacations. We never went to Disneyland. Never had a big house with a backyard. But we had each other, and I thought that was enough. I thought love could fill in all the gaps that money couldn't. Every birthday, I'd bake him a cake from scratch, because buying one from the bakery was too expensive. Every Christmas, I'd save up for months, just to buy him one special gift, the one thing he'd been talking about all year. I'd wrap it carefully, watch his face light up on Christmas morning, and feel like maybe, just maybe, I was doing okay. When Daniel was 12, he came home from school one day and asked me why we didn't have a dad like the other kids. I remember that moment so clearly. We were sitting at our kitchen table, the one I'd bought secondhand from a garage sale. I looked at him, this beautiful boy with his father's eyes and my stubborn chin, and I told him the truth. I said his father had left, but that didn't mean Daniel was any less loved. I told him that some families look different, and ours was just us two, and that was perfectly fine. He nodded, but I saw something change in his eyes that day, a kind of sadness that I couldn't fix with a hug or a homemade cake. The teenage years were hard. Daniel became distant, moody. He'd lock himself in his room for hours. I told myself it was normal, that all teenagers go through this phase. But there were moments when I'd catch him staring out the window with this lost expression, and I'd wonder what he was thinking about. I tried to talk to him, asked him about school, about his friends, about his dreams. He'd give me one-word answers. Fine, good, whatever. I felt him slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to hold on. When he turned 16, he got his first girlfriend. Her name was Stephanie. She was from one of the wealthy families in town, the kind of family that had a swimming pool in their backyard and took ski trips to Colorado every winter. Daniel started spending more and more time at her house. He'd come home and tell me about their big dinners, their fancy cars, their vacation home in the mountains. I could see it in his eyes. He was comparing their life to ours, and we came up short, way short. One night, he came home late. I was waiting up for him, worried sick. When he walked through the door, I asked him where he'd been. He looked at me with this cold expression and said, "At Stephanie's house, where people actually have things, where life isn't just about scraping by." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stood there speechless as he walked past me to his room and shut the door. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how hard I'd worked, how much I'd sacrificed, but I didn't. I just stood there in our small living room and cried quietly so he wouldn't hear me. Things got worse after that. Daniel became ashamed of me, of our life. He stopped inviting friends over. When I'd offer to drive him somewhere, he'd tell me he'd rather walk. I knew why. Our car was old, rusted, barely running, It embarrassed him. I embarrassed him. The woman who had given up everything for him had become a source of shame that hurt more than anything his father had ever done to me. Despite everything, I kept pushing forward. I kept working my 2 jobs, kept putting food on the table, kept paying for his school supplies, his clothes, his phone bill. When he graduated high school, I was so proud. I sat in that auditorium, watching him walk across the stage, and I cried tears of joy. My son, the first person in our family to graduate high school, he had gotten into a decent college about 2 hours away. I had saved every penny I could for years to help with tuition. It wasn't much, but it was something. The day I drove him to college, he barely spoke to me. I helped him carry his boxes up to his dorm room. I met his roommate, a nice kid named Marcus from Seattle. I tried to make small talk, tried to give Daniel some last-minute motherly advice. He nodded impatiently, clearly wanting me to leave. When it was time to go, I hugged him tight. He gave me a quick, stiff hug back. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me leave. For a second, I thought I saw relief on his face. College changed Daniel, or maybe it just revealed who he'd been becoming all along. He rarely called. When he did, our conversations were brief and surface level. How are classes? Fine. Do you need anything? No? Okay, I love you. Yeah, you too. Click. I'd stare at the phone after he hung up, feeling the distance between us growing wider and wider. But I told myself it was normal. He was finding himself, becoming independent. This was what I'd raised him for, wasn't it? To not need me anymore. After college, Daniel got a good job at a marketing firm in the city. He moved into a nice apartment, started making real money. He'd send me pictures sometimes, his new furniture, his view from the balcony, him at fancy restaurants with his colleagues. I was happy for him, truly. But there was always this ache in my chest, an ache that whispered, he doesn't need you anymore. You're no longer part of his new life. I retired from my night cleaning job when I turned 56. My knees couldn't handle it anymore. All those years of scrubbing floors had taken their toll. I kept working at the dental clinic part-time, just to have something to do, to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. My life had become small and quiet. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, watch TV, go to bed, repeat. The apartment felt empty without Daniel. Sometimes I'd walk past his old room and just stand there, remembering when he was little, when he still needed me, when I was his whole world. Then, about 3 months ago, something changed. Daniel met someone. Her name was Victoria. He told me about her over the phone, and I could hear the excitement in his voice, an emotion I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Victoria came from money, old money. Her family owned a successful real estate business. Daniel was head over heels. He talked about her constantly, how smart she was, how beautiful, how her family had this amazing house in the suburbs, how her father had connections that could help Daniel's career. 2 months later, he called to tell me they were engaged. Engaged. My son was getting married, and I'd never even met this woman. I tried to be happy for him. I said all the right things. Congratulations. That's wonderful. I can't wait to meet her. But inside, I felt a sense of dread. I knew what was coming. I could feel it. The wedding was set for next spring. Daniel told me it would be a big event. Victoria's family was sparing no expense. I told him I'd start saving up for a nice dress. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Yeah, about that, Mom. We need to talk." My heart sank. I knew that tone. It was the same tone he'd used when he told me he was too busy to come home for Thanksgiving. The same tone he'd used when he canceled our planned lunch 3 times in a row. He explained that Victoria's family was very traditional, very concerned with appearances and social standing. They were the kind of people who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Palm Beach, the kind of people who had never struggled a day in their lives. And Daniel, my Daniel, was trying desperately to fit into their world. He was ashamed of where he came from, ashamed of the tiny apartment he grew up in, ashamed of his mother who cleaned offices for a living. He didn't say it directly, but I heard it in every carefully chosen word. Last week, I decided I needed to see him. I needed to look my son in the eyes and remind him of who he was, where he came from. I got dressed in my nicest outfit, a simple blue dress I'd bought on sale years ago. I took the bus into the city, then walked the 6 blocks to his apartment building. It was a beautiful building, all glass and steel, with a doorman and everything. I felt out of place immediately, but I pressed forward. I took the elevator up to the 8th floor, found his door, and knocked. My heart was pounding. I hadn't seen him in person in almost a year. The door opened, and there he was. My son, taller than I remembered, more polished. He was wearing expensive clothes, designer jeans, and a crisp button-down shirt. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Mom, what are you doing here?" I smiled, trying to hide my nervousness. I told him I wanted to see him, that I'd missed him, that we needed to talk. He looked uncomfortable, glancing back into his apartment. That's when I heard a woman's voice from inside. "Daniel? Who is it?" "Victoria." She appeared behind him, and I saw her for the first time. She was beautiful. I'll give her that. Tall, blonde, perfectly put together. She looked at me with polite curiosity, then at Daniel with a question in her eyes. Daniel cleared his throat. He introduced me as his mother, and I saw Victoria's expression change. Just slightly, but I saw it, a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe? Or was it disappointment? She smiled, a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said it was nice to meet me. But she didn't invite me in. Neither did Daniel. We stood there in the hallway, this awkward triangle of tension. I tried to make conversation. I asked about the wedding plans, about how they met, about Victoria's family. Victoria answered politely but briefly, and I could feel her discomfort. Or maybe it was Daniel's discomfort I was feeling, radiating off him in waves. After a few minutes of painful small talk, Victoria excused herself, saying she had phone calls to make. She disappeared back into the apartment, leaving Daniel and me alone in the hallway. That's when I asked if I could come in. I just wanted to sit down with my son, have a cup of tea, talk like we used to when he was little. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked everywhere except at my face. Then he said, "Actually, Mom, now's not a great time. Victoria's family is coming over for dinner tonight, and we're still preparing everything." I felt my chest tighten, but I nodded. I understood. I told him maybe we could grab coffee sometime soon. Just the two of us. He gave me a vague response. "Yeah, maybe. I'll check my schedule and let you know." I knew what that meant. It meant no. It meant not anytime soon. It meant he was too busy with his new life to make time for his old one. I was about to leave, about to turn around and walk away, when I made one last attempt. I reached out and touched his arm. I looked into his eyes, those eyes that used to look at me with so much love and trust, and I said, "Daniel, you're my son. No matter how successful you become, no matter who you marry, you'll always be my son, and I'll always be here for you. Always." I hoped my words would break through whatever wall he'd built between us. I hoped he'd soften, maybe even hug me, and tell me he'd missed me too. But that's not what happened. Daniel looked at my hand on his arm, then back at my face. And what he said next, I'll never forget. As long as I live, he said, "Mom, I appreciate everything you did for me growing up. I really do. But my life is different now. I'm building something here, a future with Victoria. Her family has certain expectations, certain standards, and I need to focus on that right now. So maybe it's better if you don't just show up unannounced anymore. It's complicated." I turned to walk away, and that's when he said it. Those words that have haunted me ever since. "Mom, wait." I stopped, turned back, hoping maybe he was about to apologize, to take it all back. But instead, he said, "Look, I need you to understand something. There's no room for you here. In this life I'm building. Victoria's family, they're different from us. They wouldn't understand our background, our situation. It's just easier if we keep some distance, at least for now. There's no room for you here." Those words hit me like a physical blow. My son, the baby I'd held in my arms, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, was telling me there was no room for me in his life. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door he was already starting to close. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him and shake him and ask him how he could be so cruel. But I didn't. I just nodded, turned around, and walked away. I walked down that hallway, in a daze. Got in the elevator, walked past the doorman who held the door open for me, walked the 6 blocks to the bus stop, sat on the bus for 45 minutes, staring out the window, seeing nothing, got off at my stop, walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, opened the door, and only then, Only when I was safely inside with the door locked behind me did I allow myself to break down. I cried harder than I'd cried in years. I cried for all the sacrifices that didn't matter, for all the nights I went without sleep, so Daniel could have a better life, for all the dreams I'd given up, the opportunities I'd passed on, the life I'd never lived because I was too busy being a mother. And in the end, it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. I would never be enough for him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my relationship with Daniel. Where had I gone wrong? Had I loved him too much? Not enough? Had I been too lenient? Too strict? I tortured myself with these questions, knowing there were no good answers. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. I would respect Daniel's wishes. I would stay out of his life. If that's what he wanted, if that's what would make him happy, then I would do it, even if it killed me. The next morning, I woke up exhausted but determined to keep myself busy. I couldn't just sit in my apartment and wallow in self-pity. I got dressed, made myself breakfast, and was about to leave for the dental clinic when I heard a knock at my door. A knock that would change everything. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mrs. Patterson usually just called if she needed something, and the mailman never knocked. Confused, I walked to the door and opened it, and standing there, looking nervous and uncomfortable, was Victoria. Victoria, my son's fiancée. The woman from the wealthy family. The woman who was apparently too good for Daniel's embarrassing mother. She was standing in my doorway, and she looked nothing like the polished, confident person I'd met the day before. She looked uncertain, almost scared. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she said, "Julia, I'm sorry to show up like this. I know this must be strange, but I need to talk to you. It's important." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, the way Daniel had essentially slammed his door in mine. But curiosity won out. I stepped aside and let her in. Victoria walked into my small apartment, her expensive shoes clicking on the worn linoleum floor. I saw her take in her surroundings, the outdated furniture, the peeling paint on the walls, the general shabbiness of everything. I waited for judgment to cross her face, but instead, I saw something else. Sadness, maybe? Or was it guilt? I offered her coffee, more out of habit than genuine hospitality. She accepted, and we sat down at my small kitchen table, the same table where I'd had so many meals with Daniel when he was growing up, the same table where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd played board games, where we'd talked about his dreams and fears. Victoria wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, and I noticed they were shaking slightly. She started talking, and what she told me shook me to my core. She said she'd overheard my conversation with Daniel in the hallway yesterday. She'd heard everything he said to me, and she'd spent the entire night unable to sleep, thinking about it. She told me that when Daniel first introduced her to the idea of meeting his mother, he'd been vague about his background. He'd mentioned that I lived alone, that his father wasn't in the picture, but he'd never given her details. He'd painted a picture of a comfortable middle-class upbringing, nothing extravagant, but nothing to be ashamed of either. But yesterday, when she saw me, saw how I was dressed, saw how Daniel treated me, something clicked for her. She started asking him questions. Where exactly did he grow up? How did we afford his education? What did I do for a living? At first, Daniel tried to avoid answering, but Victoria pushed. She told him she deserved to know the truth about the man she was marrying. And finally, late last night, he told her everything. He told her about our tiny apartment, about me working 2 jobs, about the times we had our electricity shut off, about the secondhand clothes and the homemade birthday cakes, about how poor we really were. And as Victoria recounted this conversation to me, I felt my face burning with shame. Not shame for how we'd lived, but shame that my son felt he had to hide it, that he saw our life together as something dirty and embarrassing. But then Victoria said something that surprised me. She said, "Julia, when Daniel finished telling me all of this, do you know what I felt? I felt angry. Not at you, at him." She looked me straight in the eyes, and I saw tears forming. My family has money. We've always had money. And yes, we have certain expectations about social status and appearances. But you know what we value more than anything? Integrity, loyalty, gratitude. And Daniel showed none of those things yesterday. She told me that she'd spent the night thinking about her own mother. Victoria's mother had everything: money, status, a perfect life on paper. But Victoria said her mother was cold, distant, more concerned with appearances than with genuine connection. She said she'd give anything to have a mother who'd sacrificed for her the way I'd sacrificed for Daniel. She said what Daniel had done, rejecting me, being ashamed of me, it showed a lack of character that deeply troubled her. I didn't know what to say. I sat there stunned, as this woman I'd met only yesterday told me that my son didn't deserve me. She said she'd confronted Daniel that morning, told him that his treatment of me was unacceptable. She'd given him an ultimatum. Either he made things right with me, or she was calling off the engagement. She wasn't going to marry a man who could be so cruel to the person who loved him most in this world. I finally found my voice. I told Victoria that while I appreciated her kindness, she shouldn't throw away her relationship with Daniel because of me. I told her that maybe Daniel just needed time, that eventually he'd come around. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Victoria shook her head. She said, "Julia, you're making excuses for him, just like you probably did his whole life. But he's a grown man now, and he needs to take responsibility for his actions." We talked for over an hour. Victoria told me stories about Daniel that I'd never heard, how he'd lied to her about various things, small lies, but lies nonetheless, how he'd been obsessed with impressing her family, to the point where he'd become almost a different person around them, how she'd started noticing changes in him, a superficiality that hadn't been there when they first met. She said my rejection had been the final straw, the moment when she realized that the man she'd fallen in love with might not actually exist. Before she left, Victoria hugged me. A real hug, warm and genuine. She apologized for what Daniel had done. She told me I deserved better, and she said something that stuck with me. "Julia, you spent 23 years teaching Daniel how to survive, but you forgot to teach him how to be grateful. That's not your failure, that's his." Then she left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a cold cup of coffee. I spent the rest of that day in a fog. Part of me felt vindicated, validated by Victoria's words. Someone had seen what Daniel did and called it wrong. But another part of me felt even worse, because now my son was potentially losing the woman he loved because of his treatment of me. And even though he'd hurt me, even though he'd rejected me, I didn't want to be the reason his life fell apart. That evening, around 6 o'clock, there was another knock at my door. This time, I knew who it would be before I even opened it. Daniel. He was standing there, and he looked terrible. His eyes were red and puffy. His hair was a mess. He looked like he'd been crying, and I'd only seen my son cry a handful of times in his entire life. The last time was at his high school graduation. Happy tears because he'd made it. These were different tears. These were tears of regret. He didn't wait for me to invite him in. He pushed past me into the apartment, started pacing back and forth in my small living room. He was muttering to himself, running his hands through his hair. I closed the door and just watched him, unsure what to do. Finally, he stopped pacing and looked at me. And what he said next, I'll remember forever. He said, "Mom, Victoria's leaving me. She said she can't marry someone who treats their mother the way I treated you. She said I'm not the man she thought I was." His voice cracked on those last words, and I saw fresh tears rolling down his face. I waited for him to continue, to apologize, to tell me he was sorry for what he'd said. But that's not what happened. Instead, he got angry. He started yelling. He said, "This is your fault. If you hadn't shown up yesterday, none of this would be happening. Why couldn't you just stay away like I asked? Why do you always have to complicate things?" I stood there, shocked, as my son blamed me for the consequences of his own actions. He was furious, pacing again, his hands clenched into fists. He said Victoria had no right to get involved, that this was between him and me, that she didn't understand how hard he'd worked to build his new life. I let him rant. I let him get it all out, and when he finally stopped, when he stood there breathing hard and glaring at me, I spoke. I kept my voice calm, steady. I said, "Daniel, I didn't ruin your relationship. You did. When you told me there was no room for me in your life, when you chose to be ashamed of where you came from, when you decided that money and status were more important than the person who raised you, those were your choices, not mine." He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished. I told him that I'd spent 23 years loving him unconditionally. I'd worked myself to the bone to give him opportunities I never had. I'd sacrificed my health, my happiness, my entire life to make sure he had a chance at something better. And I didn't regret any of it. But I also wouldn't apologize for existing. I wouldn't apologize for being his mother, and I certainly wouldn't take the blame for him losing Victoria because he couldn't treat me with basic human decency. Daniel stared at me like I'd slapped him. I don't think he'd ever heard me talk to him like that before. I'd always been gentle with him, always made excuses for his behavior, always put his needs above my own. But something had changed in me. Maybe it was hitting rock bottom the night before. Maybe it was Victoria's visit that morning, hearing someone else validate my pain. Whatever it was, I'd found a backbone I didn't know I had. I told Daniel that if he wanted to fix things with Victoria, he needed to look in the mirror and figure out who he'd become. I told him that the little boy I'd raised, the one who used to hug me tight and tell me I was the best mom in the world, that boy would be ashamed of the man standing in front of me now. And then I did something I'd never done before. I asked him to leave. I told him I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. I said when he was ready to have an honest conversation, when he was ready to take responsibility for his actions, he could come back, but not before. Daniel looked stunned. He started to say something, then stopped. He looked around the apartment at the walls that had sheltered him his entire childhood, at the couch where we'd watched movies together, at the kitchen where I'd made him thousands of meals. I saw something shift in his expression. Just for a moment, he looked like that little boy again, lost and scared and needing his mother. But then his pride kicked back in. He straightened up, nodded stiffly, and walked out the door. After he left, I collapsed on the couch. I'd just kicked my son out of my apartment, the son I'd spent over 2 decades protecting and nurturing. Part of me wanted to run after him, to tell him I didn't mean it, to fix things like I'd always fix things. But I stayed on that couch, because for the first time in my life, I was putting myself first. I was drawing a boundary, and it was terrifying and liberating all at once. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence. No calls, no texts, nothing. I went to work at the dental clinic, came home, tried to keep myself busy, but my mind was always on Daniel. I wondered if I'd been too harsh. I wondered if he hated me now. I wondered if I'd lost him forever. Mrs. Patterson checked on me every day. She'd known Daniel since he was a baby, and I'd told her a little bit about what had happened. She kept telling me I'd done the right thing, that sometimes people need tough love to wake up, but I wasn't so sure. On the 4th day, I got a text from Victoria. It said, "Thank you for what you said to Daniel. He needed to hear it. I hope you're okay." I texted back, asking if they were still together. She replied, "We're talking, taking it day by day, but he has a lot to figure out." That gave me a tiny bit of hope. At least they hadn't completely ended things. A week after Daniel had stormed out of my apartment, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a soft knock at my door. It was late, almost 10 o'clock. I looked through the peephole and saw Daniel standing there. He looked different somehow, smaller, more vulnerable. I opened the door, and we stood there looking at each other for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, can I come in, please?" His voice was quiet, almost childlike. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked over to the couch and sat down, and I sat in the chair across from him. The same positions we'd been in countless times over the years, but this time felt different. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Daniel started talking. He said he'd spent the last week doing a lot of thinking. He'd taken time off work. He'd been seeing a therapist, something Victoria had suggested, and he'd been going through old photo albums, looking at pictures of us when he was little. He said he'd forgotten what our life was really like back then. Not the poverty part, but the love part. The way I'd read to him every night before bed. The way we'd dance around the kitchen while making dinner. The way I'd hold him when he had nightmares and tell him everything would be okay. He said somewhere along the way, as he got older and more aware of what we didn't have, he'd let resentment build up. He'd started comparing our life to other people's lives, and we always came up short in his mind. He was embarrassed by our old car, our small apartment, my worn-out clothes, and that embarrassment had turned into something uglier, into shame, into a desire to distance himself from his past, from me, so he could reinvent himself as someone from a different background. Tears were streaming down his face as he talked. He said meeting Victoria and her family had made it worse. He'd felt this pressure to be someone he wasn't, to pretend he came from money, to act like he belonged in their world. And I, his mother, was evidence that he didn't belong. I was a living reminder of where he really came from. So he'd tried to push me away, to make me small and invisible, so he could keep up his charade. He looked at me with so much pain in his eyes and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. What I said to you about there being no room for you, that was the cruelest thing I've ever done. And you didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve any of the way I've treated you these last few years." His voice broke completely, and he put his head in his hands and sobbed, full body shaking sobs. I sat there watching my son fall apart, and I felt my own tears starting to fall. All the anger I'd been holding on to, all the hurt, it started to crack, because no matter what he'd done, no matter how much he'd hurt me, he was still my son. He was still that little boy I'd rocked to sleep, the child I'd have died for without a second thought. And seeing him in pain, even pain of his own making, broke my heart. I got up from my chair and sat down next to him on the couch. I put my arms around him, and he collapsed into me, crying into my shoulder like he used to do when he was little, and something had upset him. I held him and let him cry, rubbing his back and whispering that it was okay, that we'd figure it out, that I loved him. Because I did. Despite everything, I loved him more than anything in this world. When he finally calmed down, he pulled away and wiped his eyes. He said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I'm asking for it anyway. I want to do better. I want to be the son you deserve. I want to make you proud again." I told him he'd always made me proud, even when he was making mistakes, even when he was pushing me away. I told him that loving your child doesn't stop just because they hurt you. It doesn't work that way. We talked for hours that night, really talked in a way we hadn't in years. He told me about the pressure he'd been feeling, trying to live up to Victoria's family's expectations. I told him about how lonely I'd been, how much I'd missed him. He apologized again and again, and each time I told him I forgave him. Because I did. Not because what he did was okay, but because holding on to anger would have destroyed us both. He told me that Victoria had given him a second chance, but only on the condition that he rebuild his relationship with me. She'd made it clear that family was important to her, and if he couldn't value his own mother, then he wasn't the kind of man she wanted to marry. Daniel said he'd realized she was right. He'd been so focused on what Victoria's family thought of him that he'd lost sight of what really mattered. He'd betrayed the one person who'd always been in his corner, no matter what. Before he left that night, he asked if we could start over. Not forget what happened, but move forward from it. He wanted to introduce me properly to Victoria, to her family. He wanted to stop hiding where he came from and start being honest about his story, our story. He said he was proud of me, of what I'd accomplished as a single mother, and he wanted other people to know that too. I told him I'd like that very much. Over the next few months, things slowly got better between us. Daniel started coming over regularly. We'd have dinner together, just talking and catching up. He brought Victoria a few times, and I got to know her better. She was a good person, much deeper than I'd initially given her credit for. She asked me questions about Daniel's childhood, and I shared stories that made her laugh and sometimes made her cry. I could see her falling even more in love with him, but with the real him this time, not the polished version he'd been performing. Daniel also started opening up to Victoria's family about his background. It wasn't easy for him, and I could tell he was terrified of their judgment. But they surprised him. Victoria's father told Daniel that he respected him more now, knowing what he'd overcome to get where he was. He said anyone could succeed when they were handed everything on a silver platter, but it took real character to build a life from nothing. Victoria's mother was kind to me when we finally met, asking thoughtful questions and never making me feel less than. The wedding happened last month. It was beautiful. Everything Victoria had dreamed of, and I was there, sitting in the front row, wearing a dress that Daniel and Victoria had helped me pick out. During his speech at the reception, Daniel talked about me. He told everyone how I'd raised him alone, how I'd worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities, how I'd sacrificed everything for his future. His voice shook as he said, "My mom taught me how to survive, but I forgot to thank her. I forgot to honor her. I'm standing here today because of her, and I will never forget that again." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the speech, Daniel came over to me. He took my hands in his and said, "Mom, I know I can never make up for the time I wasted being ashamed of you, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying. I love you, and there will always be room for you. In my life, in my home, in my heart, always." I hugged him tight, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back, not the little boy he used to be, but the man he'd become. a man who'd made mistakes but had found his way back to what mattered. Now, as I sit here in my apartment, looking at the wedding photos Daniel and Victoria sent me, I think about everything we went through to get to this point. It wasn't easy. It was painful and messy, and there were moments I thought we'd never recover. But we did. Because at the end of the day, love is stronger than pride. Family is stronger than shame. And forgiveness, real forgiveness, can heal even the deepest wounds. I learned something through all of this. I learned that sacrificing everything for your child doesn't guarantee they'll appreciate it. I learned that you can't protect your children from becoming people you don't recognize. But I also learned that it's never too late to change course, to admit when you're wrong, to rebuild what was broken. Daniel had to learn those lessons the hard way, but he learned them, and that's what matters. My relationship with my son isn't perfect. We still have moments where old patterns try to resurface, where he gets caught up in appearances, or I get too worried about being a burden. But we're working on it. We're honest with each other now in a way we never were before. And that honesty, as painful as it sometimes is, has made us closer than we've ever been. So when people ask me if I regret the sacrifices I made for Daniel, I tell them no, because those sacrifices gave him life, gave him opportunity, gave him a chance at a better future. Do I wish he'd appreciated them sooner? Of course. Do I wish I hadn't had to hit rock bottom before he woke up? Absolutely. But the journey, as difficult as it was, taught both of us lessons we needed to learn. And now we're on the other side of it, stronger and more grateful than before. There's no room for you here. Those words used to haunt me, used to wake me up in the middle of the night with tears on my face. But now when I think about them, I remember what came after. I remember my son crying in my arms, apologizing, promising to do better. I remember him standing up at his wedding and honoring me in front of everyone he cared about. I remember him showing up at my door last week with groceries because he knew money was tight. And I remember him saying, "Mom, there will always be room for you." That's the thing about love. It can be broken, betrayed, stomped on and thrown away. But if both people are willing to fight for it, willing to admit their mistakes and do the hard work of healing, it can come back stronger than before. My son broke my heart, but he also mended it. And now, looking at who he's becoming, at the man he's choosing to be, I couldn't be more proud. My name is Julia. I'm 58 years old. I raised my son alone for 23 years. There were times I thought he'd forgotten where he came from, forgotten me, and for a while, maybe he did, but he found his way back, and that's all that matters. We found our way back to each other, and now finally there's room for both of us in each other's lives, always. So that's my story. The day my son told me there was no room for me in his life, I thought I had lost him forever. But sometimes, the deepest wounds lead to the strongest healing. Now I want to ask you, have you ever been rejected by someone you loved unconditionally? How did you handle it? Please share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more real-life stories. Thank you for listening to my journey. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to rebuild what's broken.